Yahweh is not receiving an inheritance from Eljon in Deuteronomy 32 and verse 8.
All right, let's see it.
Because in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the word in verse 9 for inheritance is actually primarily defined as possession or property. This is the word being used, and here it explains that the primary definition is possession, also property or inheritance.
So the argument here seems to be that we should not understand Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 to be describing Adonai receiving Israel as an inheritance from Elyon, because the word nalah, according to this outdated 19th century lexicon to which this content creator continuously appeals, says that the primary sense is possession and inheritance is only a secondary sense. And the suggestion there is that we ought to accept the primary sense and we ought to reject the secondary sense. And hopefully the methodological problems here are just shrieking at you, because they are shrieking at me. And the first problem is with this notion that it matters what the primary sense is. It only matters how the word is being used in this context. And we're going to come back to that. However, I also want to point to a problem with the notion that this lexical entry is describing two separate and incommensurate senses, because that's not what's going on here. And to illustrate this, I want to look at more up-to-date and reliable resources. For instance, Halot, the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, widely considered the most authoritative lexicon of biblical Hebrew available today. In the red box, you have the beginning of the entry for nalah, and almost halfway down you have the bold words. That is the primary sense of the word nalah: inalienable, hereditary property. So even if we do divide it up into possession and inheritance, it doesn't mean it either means possession or it means this entirely separate thing, namely inheritance. It actually means possession as an inheritance. And we can go on to Klein's Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, and you see the beginning of the entry in the bottom right, nachalah. What does it mean? Inheritance, possession, inalienable, hereditary property. And then it goes on, land as inheritance, nations as inheritance, Adonai as inheritance, tithes and offerings as inheritance, Israel as inheritance of Adonai, inheritance as one's portion, share of righteousness, truth, etc. But we can go into even more detail. We can look at the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament. Volume 9 has dozens of pages on the verbal root nachal and the derived noun nachalah. I just want to look at the very first paragraph under semantics. 1, literal meaning. The verb nachal appears 59 times in the OT. The noun nachalah 220 times. Both are found in a variety of Semitic languages and are attested as Amorite loanwords as early as the Old Babylonian documents from Mari. They reflect the legal language of the Northwest Semites. The verb means that a joint heir has received his portion by succession, while the noun denotes the portion received. In other words, the action denoted by the verb consists in transforming the right to a total estate into an exclusive right to a portion, called in Hebrew nachalah, in Ugaritic nachalatu, and in Amorite nechlatu. The meaning of nachalah is thus narrower than that of inheritance, because strictly speaking it cannot be applied to an undivided estate. And so what this is saying is that a nachalah is a portion or a division of an estate that offspring or somebody else receives as, you guessed it, an inheritance. Now it becomes inalienable property. It becomes a possession because of this context of receiving this as an inheritance. But again, I said it only matters what it means in context. So let's look at Deuteronomy 32:8 and 32:9. The very first word of verse 8, Bahanchel. What is this? This is the hifil, infinitive construct of the verbal root nachal. So what is Eljon doing? Eljon is causing to inherit. Eljon is distributing an inheritance. The context for these two verses is the distribution of the nations as an inheritance to the children of God. Now, in the Masoretic text, which is represented here, Verse 8 ends in Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. We know that is a secondary reading because the Septuagint, as well as 4Q Deuteronomy J in the Dead Sea Scrolls, shows that originally it had Bnei Elohim, children of God. And we're going to come back to that later in this video. But when it says in verse 9, Adonai's portion was his people, Jacob his share of the inheritance, or the share of his inheritance. That is that concept of inalienable hereditary property, his share. So it is being divided up, and Adonai is receiving one share, one portion of the stuff that Eljon is distributing as inheritance. And let's take a look at that verbal root just so you can see that in the Hifil, it definitely refers to distribution of an inheritance. Here is halot. This is the entry for the verbal root nachal, and in the Hifil stem, which is the causative stem, sense number 1 is to give as an inheritance. Sense number 2 is to leave as an inheritance. We can look at Klein's Dictionary of Classical Hebrew. Down in the bottom right, nachal, the verbal root, to inherit, take possession of, hold as a possession. But if we go down into the Hifil stem, what does it mean in the causative stem? Cause to inherit, leave an inheritance to, give as an inheritance a lot. But let's go back to verse 9 and look at a bit more of the context, because we have the specific construct phrase, chevel nachlato. So that is share of his inheritance, or his share of the inheritance. And how do we know that this definitely refers to inheritance? Well, we have a very similar construct phrase that occurs in 3 other places in the Hebrew Bible, where we have chevel, and then we have nachalah with a pronominal suffix. So in Psalm 105:11, the very last 2 words, chevel nachalatechem, and that is the second person masculine plural pronominal suffix, yals. And what does this say? Saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as your share of the inheritance. So this is the land of Canaan as an inheritance. In 1 Chronicles 16:18, you have almost the exact same statement. The only difference is that you do not have the definite direct object marker et prior to Eretz Canaan. So again, the land of Canaan is Israel's share of the inheritance. And then we also have in Numbers 18:20 a reference to the fact that the Levites would not have a portion. And then toward the end of the verse, God says, I am your share and your inheritance, because they are otherwise not receiving this inalienable real property, because the Levites don't get that real property. So when we talk about the context of Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9, what's happening here? Eljon is distributing the nations as inheritance to the Bnei Elohim, the children of God. And verse 9 says, Adonai's portion is his people, Jacob, his share of the inheritance. The notion that it just means his possession not only ignores the word chevel, but ignores the context entirely, ignores that this is all about Eljon distributing the nations as an inheritance, based on the very first word of verse 8, the Hifil infinitive construct of the verbal root nachal, which means to inherit, and in the Hifil causative stem means to give, distribute, or leave as an inheritance. This is not really up for serious debate, which is why what's going on here is not a serious debate.
And the context of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that Yahweh is the creator of the world. Explains this in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 4 in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Also in Exodus chapter 20 verse 11 explains that Yahweh is the creator of the heavens and the earth. So it's true that in the Septuagint it simply says ton theon and ton hypsistos, which means the God, the Most High. So it's interpreted as only meaning El Elyon. And it says that El Elyon created the heavens and the earth. So the creator of the heavens and the earth is Yahweh, according to the context of the Torah and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Therefore, Yahweh is El Elyon.
So I have already fully engaged all of these claims in my previous video, number McClellan 2774, and obviously this content creator cannot even acknowledge, much less directly engage what I said in that video.
Also, El does not appear in verse 8 of the Dead Sea Scrolls for Deuteronomy 32, and so it simply says Eljon, which means the Most High.
This is true, but in the earliest usage of Eljon, the title is overwhelmingly associated with the divine name El, and it is only in the later usage that it becomes associated with the divine name Adonai. And also, when you look at the way Eljon is represented, they are represented as a patriarchal high deity, which is the divine profile of El and not of Adonai. Adonai's divine profile is that of the second tier Northwest Semitic storm deity, an entirely different divine profile.
And it explains that he's dividing the people according to the numbers of the Ben Elohim, which Ben Elohim is a reference to the sons of rulers, is the context, because Elohim is a versatile term that can mean rulers, judges, angels, or even a reference to false gods. So in the context of the verses, talking about the sons of rulers, and it's not properly translated as the sons of God.
This is entirely false. Elohim does not mean rulers. It does not mean judges. It means God, gods, or it can be used adjectively to mean divine. I discuss this in chapters 1 and 3 of my book, Adonai's Divine Images, A Cognitive Approach. Chapter 1 is entitled, What is a Deity? Chapter 3 is entitled, Deity in the Hebrew Bible. I go into great detail there and discuss the fact that the notion that Elohim refers to rulers or powerful ones or judges is based on outdated apologetics and false etymologies. It's basically a refusal to accept the fact that the Bible frequently refers to other gods. And the phrase B'nai Elohim, we know, does not refer to rulers or powerful ones or judges, because it is frequently used in contexts that cannot mean anything other than deities. So for instance, Job 1:6, we have, and it came to pass on that day that the B'nai Ha-Elohim, children of the God, came to present themselves before Adonai, and also Ha-Satan, the Satan, came among them. So this is something that's going on in the heavens. These are divine beings that are presenting themselves before God. We can look at Job 38:4-7. Verse 4 talks about, where were you when I set the foundations of the earth? This is talking to Job saying, hey, I've been here a lot longer than you have. Where were you when I created the earth? And we have down in verse 7, when all the B'nai Elohim, the children of God, shouted for joy at the foundation of the earth. Obviously, this is referring to gods, to divine beings, and not to humans. We also have Genesis 6:2, where we have the B'nai Ha-Elohim contrasted against Benot Ha'adam. So the children of God over and against the daughters of humanity, human women. So it's divine beings, human women. There is a contrast going on here. And this is one of the things that gives rise in later periods, particularly in the Enochic literature, to the interpretation of B'nai Ha-Elohim or B'nai Elohim, or even B'nai Elim, as we see in Psalms 29:1, as a reference to angels. Can be a reference to angels because angels are gods, but fundamentally it's just a reference to gods. And we can look in more up-to-date contemporary lexical entries for this as well. Conveniently, the entire entry for Elohim in Halot takes up this entire page. You can see in the upper left, the first main sense is gods, because Elohim is plural. And then about halfway down that left column, you see the M-2, Elohim becomes singular. And so you also have the sense God, deity. It does not refer to rulers, to powerful ones, to judges. If Elohim is used in reference to a human, as it is, for instance, in reference to the Davidic king in Psalm 45, or to Moses in Exodus 7:1, it's referring to them as divine or as a deity. And the notion that this can't happen is based on the presupposition that the human and the divine were a binary. They were two incommensurate categories, and that's just not the case. It is more of a spectrum. It is more of a continuum. And again, you can look in chapter 1 of my book, Adonai's Divine Images, A Cognitive Approach, to see a full discussion of how that is. So again, the notion that B'nai Elohim or Elohim all by itself refers to anything other than gods, a god, or the adjectival sense of divine is outdated, it's apologetic, it's based on false etymologies, it's based on presuppositional approaches to the scriptures. It is dogmatic, it is not based on any data.
So Tantheon can be interpreted to understand that it can replace the Tetragrammaton. Therefore, It can be seen in the Septuagint for Genesis 14 and verse 22 in the Codex Vaticanus that Yahweh is the Most High. If we read further, it explains that Kyrios is the primary substitute, but that Tontheon can also be used.
So again, this content creator is retreating to claims he has already made in this video and to claims that he made in a previous video, all of which I have already fully responded to in my video number McClellan 2774, which he saw before making the current video and which he has not even acknowledged, much less engaged. And I want to point to one other thing, and this is something that I do not normally do, I'm not comfortable doing, and I will not do again. I want to highlight how poorly he is pronouncing the Greek word Kyrios. He says Kyrios, which means he not only doesn't understand how Greek is pronounced, he doesn't understand what the accents are for, which only manifests his abject ignorance of the requisite linguistic skills and knowledge that you really need to have if you're going to pretend to lecture anybody about textual criticism of the Septuagint.
So imposing that in Deuteronomy 32 verse 9 is saying that Yahweh is receiving an inheritance would be a taking out of context of the scriptures and a mistranslation, and the correct translation would be possession, because Yahweh is the creator, is the context of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
So as I have demonstrated in this video, the context of these passages and the actual sense of these words entirely undermines the argument here, which, by the way, is ignoring the immediate context of Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, and trying to leverage the broader canonical univocal context to overrule the immediate context. And this content creator doesn't even begin to have the foggiest idea what they're doing methodologically. They're just groping around for whatever makes sense to them and entirely ignoring all of the scholarship because they don't understand the language. They don't understand the literature. They don't understand the history. They don't understand the textual criticism. They don't understand the secondary literature. All they understand is that they have a dogma and they're going to fight tooth and nail to defend that dogma, irrespective of the legitimacy, the plausibility of the argument or of the data to which they imagine they're appealing.
And there is no evidence that Deuteronomy predates Genesis and Exodus, so that is a false claim.
So this content creator is either just abjectly ignorant of the existence of critical scholarship or just dogmatically opposed to acknowledging, much less engaging critical scholarship. The notion that there's no evidence that Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 predate things like Exodus 20 or the book of Genesis is just laughably myopic and ignorant. It is the scholarly consensus that the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32 is one of the earlier literary layers of the entire book of Deuteronomy and much of Exodus and much of Genesis. And verses 8 and 9, as I have argued in print and many times on my channel, are even earlier than that, because if you look at verse 7, what we have in verses 8 and 9 is reported speech that verse 7 explains is what you will be told if you go ask your forefathers, if you go ask your ancestors. And so it predates the composition itself of the Song of Moses. And this content creator is either ignorantly or willfully refusing to even acknowledge, much less engage, the centuries of critical scholarship that have established these scholarly consensus. They're just flippantly dismissing it as if they either don't know it exists or they just refuse to engage it. And this is manifested by so many of the linguistic and the methodological and the academic shortcomings put on display in these videos, and particularly in the comments as well.
Also, Ben Elohim can be a reference to Israel, because in Exodus chapter 4, verse 22, it explains that Israel is God's firstborn son. So the sons of God are the Israelites. If you don't want to interpret it, Ben Elohim, as sons of rulers, and you interpret it as sons of God, it's still a reference to Israel, and the Masoretic texts are still correct as a reference to the sons of Israel.
No, as I demonstrate in my book, as I've shown in this video, that's absolutely not what Ben Elohim means. That's just presupposing univocality, so you can scurry off to another part of the Bible to leverage some other statement elsewhere to overrule the part of the Bible that you don't like. And here's where I'm going to extend an invitation to this content creator. If you can respond to this video either competently, that is, competently engage with my argument, with the linguistics, with the secondary literature, with the text critical arguments, if you can engage competently, or even just in good faith, if you can demonstrate that you're willing to engage my argument even just in good faith, even if it's not competent, I will happily carry on this conversation with you. However, I won't be doing that because you are very clearly neither willing nor able to do either of those things. I've been around the block enough to know when someone is going to be able to engage in good faith, and this is not one of those times. However, again, happy to be proven wrong. Prove me wrong. Show me you can engage competently or even just in good faith. Otherwise, there's nothing left to say, and we're done here. So the ball's in your court. And the fit for this video has been Wolverine.